12th century Jerusalem, a city built on faith, surrounded by desert heat, and defended by the swords of the Crusader states. It was a place where a king's survival often depended less on his army and more on his ability to outthink his enemies. In this world, one boy would grow into a king whose body betrayed him, but whose mind never did. History remembers him as the Leper King, but behind that grim nickname lies a story far richer than the disease that defined his final years. A story of a boy who was told in effect that his life would be short and painful, and who chose to spend that short life proving the world wrong. Welcome back. Today, we're telling the full story of Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem. His childhood, the diagnosis that changed everything, the battle that made him a legend, and the quiet, painful years that turned him into one of history's most respected rulers.
Baldwin was born around 1161, the son of King Amalric I of Jerusalem. As the heir to a kingdom carved out of conquest and constant war, his early education followed the path expected of every Crusader prince: horsemanship, swordplay, the etiquette of court, and the responsibilities of rule. For a while, nothing seemed unusual. He was an active, curious child, much like any other boy being groomed for a throne. But one day, a small, strange detail caught the attention of his tutor, the historian and archdeacon William of Tyre. William watched Baldwin playing with other boys. As children often do, they were pinching each other's arms in rough play, wincing and laughing at the sting. But Baldwin felt nothing at all. At first, William assumed the boy was simply tolerating pain well. Looking closer, though, he realized something was deeply wrong. The child wasn't being brave. He genuinely could not feel it. Physicians were called. After days of examination, the truth emerged, and it shook the royal household. The young prince had leprosy. Today, we understand leprosy as a bacterial infection that gradually damages the nerves, skin, and muscles, often beginning with a loss of sensation in the extremities. In the 12th century, there was no cure and very little understanding of the disease. A diagnosis of leprosy was, for most people, a death sentence. First, a slow deterioration of the body, and then exile from society, since the disease was widely and wrongly believed to be highly contagious through casual contact. For a boy who is destined to lead a kingdom surrounded by enemies, this was devastating news.
Word of the diagnosis spread through the court. Some pitied the young prince. Others quietly began to question whether he had any future at all as a ruler. It would have been easy for the world to write him off entirely, judging him only by what his body could no longer do. But that judgment ignored something crucial, because as Baldwin's physical strength declined, his intellect and discipline grew sharper. He seems to have understood early on that if his body could not be his greatest weapon, his mind would have to be. He immersed himself in the study of history, military strategy, and the political maneuvering that kept the fragile Crusader states alive in a hostile region. He grasped a principle that many rulers, then and now, fail to understand. Wars are not always won by the largest army. They are won by the smartest strategy, the best use of terrain, and the discipline to wait for the right moment to strike. While other young nobles spent their energy building physical strength and reputation on the tournament field, Baldwin was quietly building something else: judgment. In 1174, following the death of his father, Baldwin was crowned King of Jerusalem. He was 13 years old, already showing visible signs of his illness, and already underestimated by many who assumed his reign would be brief and largely symbolic. They could not have been more wrong.
The year is 1177. Baldwin is just 16 years old, and standing against him is one of the most formidable military commanders in history, Salah ad-Din, known to the West as Saladin, the man who would go on to unite much of the Muslim world and become the great rival of the Crusader states. Saladin launched an invasion from Egypt, advancing toward Jerusalem with a large and confident army. Historians estimated numbered well into the thousands, though exact figures remain debated. Baldwin, by contrast, could gather only a few hundred knights and soldiers to meet him. Even accounting for uncertainty in the numbers, nearly every historical account agrees on one thing: this was an extraordinarily lopsided confrontation. A seasoned, healthy monarch might reasonably have chosen to retreat and preserve his forces rather than risk annihilation. Baldwin chose neither retreat nor a reckless frontal assault. He chose something harder: patience and strategy. He understood that in open terrain, his small force would be overwhelmed within minutes, so he waited. He tracked Saladin's movements and let the larger army grow overconfident, spreading out as it marched, assuming no real resistance remained between it and Jerusalem.
That moment came near Montgisard, close to the coastal town of Ascalon, where Saladin's forces were strung out and vulnerable, moving through narrower terrain between hills and water. It was there, exactly when Saladin's army was least prepared to fight as a unified force, that Baldwin gave the order to attack. This is the core of what made Baldwin such an effective commander. He understood that a massive army confined to a narrow, disorganized position isn't just failing to use its size actively works against it. Archers can't loose volleys freely, cavalry can't build momentum, commanders lose the ability to coordinate. What should have been Saladin's greatest advantage became in that moment his greatest liability. Baldwin's knights struck hard, fast, and repeatedly. Wave after wave hit an enemy that had no room to regroup. Saladin's army, caught completely off guard, began to collapse into chaos. According to the chronicles, Saladin himself narrowly escaped the battlefield, reportedly fleeing on a fast camel to avoid capture, leaving behind a large portion of his forces. The Battle of Montgisard remains one of the most celebrated victories in Crusader history, a battle where a teenage king, suffering from a degenerative and painful disease, personally led a vastly outnumbered force to a decisive win against one of the greatest generals of the age. It proved something the world had been too quick to dismiss. A failing body does not necessarily mean a failing mind, and it certainly doesn't mean a failing will. News of the victory spread rapidly through the Crusader states and beyond. Baldwin, once dismissed as a fragile, doomed prince, was now spoken of as a formidable and unpredictable ruler, someone Saladin himself would need to take seriously for the rest of his career. But military glory did not slow the progression of his illness. In the years that followed, Baldwin's condition worsened steadily. He gradually lost sensation and function in his hands. His eyesight began to fail, and the visible effects of the disease on his face became impossible to hide. Riding a horse, once effortless, became a struggle. Holding a sword for any length of time caused him real pain. Historical accounts suggest that in his later years, Baldwin sometimes appeared before his court and his soldiers with his face partially covered, whether by cloth or, according to some later traditions, a metal covering. The precise details vary between sources, but the underlying reality is not in question. By his final years, the disease had visibly reshaped his appearance. And yet, he refused to let his illness define how his people saw him. He understood something that many rulers never grasp, that a leader's outward composure directly shapes the morale of everyone around them. If the king appeared to be crumbling, the kingdom would crumble with him. So whatever pain or fear he carried privately, he did not allow it to become the public face of his rule. This is worth pausing on because it's often misunderstood. Leadership isn't only about riding at the front of the charge. Real leadership is what happens when everything is falling apart and you are still the reason other people believe it isn't over yet. Baldwin's soldiers didn't follow him because they were forced to. They followed him because his calm, steady presence gave them something to hold on to in moments when panic would have been the easier choice.
As his illness advanced, ruling directly became increasingly difficult, and Baldwin had to lean more heavily on regents and trusted advisors to manage day-to-day governance. Even so, he remained deeply involved in the political questions that mattered most, particularly the fraught issue of succession, since he had no children of his own and knew that instability after his death could threaten everything the kingdom had fought to hold on to. He worked to secure alliances, manage rival factions within his own court, and keep the kingdom stable for as long as his body would allow. It was, in its own way, a second battlefield, quieter than Montgisard, but arguably just as demanding. In 1185, at just 24 years old, Baldwin IV died. It was an age at which most people today are only beginning their adult lives and careers. Yet by that point, he had already secured his place as one of the most remarkable rulers of the Crusader era. His death did not end his story. In many ways, it was only the beginning of his legacy.
Nearly 850 years later, history does not remember Baldwin IV primarily for his illness. It remembers him for his judgment, his composure under pressure, and his refusal to let circumstances he could not control define what he could still achieve. He is remembered not for the palaces he lived in, but for the decisions he made, not for the disease that reshaped his face, but for the character that never wavered beneath it. His story carries a lesson that goes far beyond medieval battlefields. Life does not distribute its challenges equally. Some people begin with real advantages. Others, like Baldwin, are handed extraordinarily difficult circumstances from the very start, through no fault of their own. But history rarely remembers people for the ease of their circumstances. It remembers them for how they responded when circumstances were anything but easy. Baldwin never used his illness as an excuse to disengage or to be pitied. Instead, he treated it as a problem to be managed with the same discipline he brought to statecraft and warfare, turning a body that was failing him into the reason he learned to lead with his mind, his composure, and his character instead. That, more than any battle, may be the real reason his name has survived for nearly 9 centuries, not as a footnote in history books, but as a genuine source of inspiration for anyone facing circumstances they didn't choose. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing for more deep dives into history, psychology, and leadership. Thank you for watching.